This isn't a Formula One car, it isn't a modern superbike, it's a Honda engine from 1966, a tiny 250 cubic centimeter six-cylinder engine with the needle on its tachometer buried past 18,000 revolutions per minute. 6 cylinders, 6 tiny carburetors, and pistons no bigger across than a shot glass. Honda called it the RC166, and here is the part that should not be possible. The screaming V10 engines that made Formula One famous did not reach these kinds of revs until the late 1990s, on their way to nearly 20,000 revolutions per minute. This little six was already doing it 3 decades earlier, built by hand, by a company most people still filed under cheap commuter bikes. So how did the company behind the Super Cub end up 30 years ahead of the pinnacle of motorsport, and why did the sport later change its own rulebook to make this engine illegal? Grab a coffee. The answer starts with a losing team and a 24-year-old nobody had heard of. By the mid-1960s, Honda was winning Grand Prix races in almost every class. Almost. In the 250 cubic centimeter class, its 4-cylinder bikes kept getting beaten, and they kept getting beaten by the same enemy. Yamaha's little RD56 two-stroke was quietly humiliating Honda's 4-strokes, and the reason came down to plain physics. A 2-stroke fires on every single turn of the crankshaft. A 4-stroke fires on every other turn. Same size, half the power strokes. On paper, Honda was bringing a knife to a gunfight, and Shoichiro Honda had bet the company's whole reputation on the 4-stroke being the future. That belief was not a small thing. The founder had made it a public, company-wide promise that Honda's future ran on clean 4-stroke engines, not the smoky 2-strokes buzzing around every other grid. Honda's own 4-cylinder 250, the RC164, was a jewel of an engine, spinning to 14,000 revolutions per minute and making around 48 horsepower. It still wasn't enough. The 2-stroke Yamahas kept crossing the line first, and every race they won was an argument that the old man had backed the wrong technology. For Honda, this had become about pride. It needed to prove a point. Remember, this was a company that had started less than 20 years earlier, in a country still digging itself out of the rubble of a lost war, and Grand Prix racing was how Honda planned to announce itself to the world. Losing to Yamaha on that stage, in front of everyone, was not something the founder was willing to accept. The job of proving it landed on a young engineer named Shoichiro Irimajiri. In 1964, Honda put him in charge of rescuing the 250 cubic centimeter program. He was 24 years old. He had joined the company only a year earlier, in 1963, straight out of the University of Tokyo, where he had studied not motorcycles, but aeronautical engineering. And it was that aircraft background that pointed him toward an answer nobody else on the grid was chasing. Irimajiri looked at the problem the way you would look at an engine that has to survive in the sky, where weight is the enemy and every part has to earn its place. He accepted the one thing he could not change. A 4-stroke will always fire half as often as a 2-stroke of the same size. That rule was locked, but there was a loophole hiding inside it. If you cannot change how often each cylinder fires per revolution, you can still change how many revolutions happen per second. In plain terms, you win the fight by revving higher. A lot higher. The catch is that revving higher is where engines go to die. Spin the crankshaft faster, and the forces tearing at every moving part climb through the roof. A heavy piston flung up and down thousands of times a second turns into a wrecking ball. So the engineer did the aeronautical thing. He made everything smaller and lighter. A small, light piston can start, stop, and reverse direction far quicker than a big heavy one, which means it can be pushed to speeds a bigger engine would never survive. Splitting the same 250 cubic centimeters across 6 little chambers instead of 4 also spread the heat over more surface area and shrank the load on each individual part, which was exactly what an engine built to live at brutal revolutions per minute needed. His plan was almost absurd in how simple it was. More cylinders, each one tiny, all screaming together. But shrinking the parts created a fresh nightmare. Tiny cylinders run hotter, tiny valves are harder to seal, and every gram of metal has to do more work under more punishment. To chase numbers this high, Honda would have to push metallurgy, precision machining, and microengineering to limits nobody in motorcycling had ever reached. And that meant asking the entire factory to build parts at a scale and an accuracy the industry did not yet know how to hit. The six-cylinder idea first hit the track in 1964, and by the following year it had become a prototype called the RC165, which proved the wild concept actually worked. Honda then spent another season sharpening it into the finished weapon, the machine that made history, the RC166. Instead of 4 cylinders, the 250 cubic centimeter class now had 6. Not 6 normal cylinders shrunk a little, 6 thimble-scale combustion chambers, each one displacing roughly 41 cubic centimeters, about the size of an espresso shot. The bore of each cylinder measured just 41 millimeters across, with an even shorter 31 millimeter stroke, so the pistons themselves were about the width of a shot glass. Bolt 6 of those together and you get an engine that reads like a watchmaker's fantasy. 2 overhead camshafts, 4 valves in every cylinder, 24 tiny valves in total, opening and closing faster than the eye can follow. 6 separate carburetors feeding 6 separate cylinders, each carburetor a tiny Keihin unit you could close your hand around. A 7-speed gearbox to keep that frantic little engine inside its narrow sweet spot, because all of its power lived right at the very top of the rev range. And despite carrying 6 cylinders, the whole unit was no wider than the 4-cylinder engine it replaced, because every single piece was so small. Raw power was only half the battle. The first version of the bike handled so badly that the team had to lengthen the frame and rework the suspension before it would turn a corner the way a world champion needed it to, and every part of it had to be machined to a precision the motorcycle industry had never attempted, cut, and finished by hand, in an era when the tools to measure that kind of accuracy were barely good enough to check the work. To this day, no major manufacturer has ever built a smaller inline 6. Not in a car, not in a bike, not anywhere. Honda made the smallest 6-cylinder engine anyone had ever built, and then it asked that engine to do something no engine that size had ever done. It asked it to rev to 18,000 revolutions per minute. Picture what that actually means. At 18,000 revolutions per minute, each of those tiny pistons is racing to the top of its cylinder and back down again around 300 times every second. 300. The valves are chattering, the crankshaft is a blur, and all 6 cylinders are firing in a sequence so fast the individual explosions blur into one continuous shriek. That is where the RC166's legendary sound comes from. The people who stood trackside in the 1960s never forgot it, a noise closer to a jet turbine or a furious hornet than anything they believed a motorcycle could make. The whole bike seemed to buzz at a pitch you would feel in your teeth. From a quarter-liter engine, all that madness produced just over 60 horsepower. Run the math and it works out to roughly 248 horsepower for every liter of displacement, which is more than a modern 1,000 cubic centimeter production superbike makes today. There was no flywheel smoothing things out, so the throttle response was instant and savage, the engine snapping to attention the moment the rider's wrist moved, with nothing to soften the hit. The internal parts were machined so fine that some of them could be flexed by hand, and yet they held together while spinning at full song. At that speed, the engine lived permanently on the edge of tearing itself apart, and Honda had to shape the camshafts specifically to stop it from over-revving into oblivion. Every tolerance was chased to a limit nobody had reached before, all of it done without a single computer, by people working with slide rules and steady nerves. If your brain is starting to ache trying to picture all of this, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is built for, so hit subscribe and stick around. Because the next question is the wild one. If Honda pulled this off in 1966, what on earth took the rest of the racing world so long to catch up? And this is where the RC166 stops being an impressive old bike and starts looking like a message from the future. Think about the sound most people would name as the greatest engine note in all of motorsport. It is the howl of a Formula One car from the V10 era, those 10-cylinder engines that raced from 1989 through 2005, and at their screaming peak, revved to almost 20,000 revolutions per minute. Fans still call it the greatest sound the sport ever made, and grown adults pull up old race footage just to hear it. Honda reached almost the same place with half as many cylinders. Now put the two side by side. Formula One needed 10 cylinders, decades of development, and eventually banks of computers and exotic alloys to spin that fast. And it did not match what this Honda was already doing until the late 1990s, more than 30 years after the RC166. A 250 cubic centimeter motorcycle from 1966 was turning nearly as fast as the most celebrated Formula One engines ever built, using 4 fewer cylinders and a tiny fraction of the technology. Everyone else took decades to catch up because the materials, the machining, and the sheer nerve it demanded barely existed yet at the level Honda had somehow reached. Honda was a full generation ahead of everyone else. The strangest part is that Honda was not even at its ceiling. The same thinking, more cylinders and smaller pistons, showed up right across Honda's racing bikes in that era. Its tiny 50 cubic centimeter twin-cylinder racer revved past 21,500 revolutions per minute. Honda had quietly worked out a rule of engine building that the rest of the world would spend the next few decades slowly rediscovering. An engine like that still needs someone brave enough to wring its neck, and Honda hired the best in the world. Mike Hailwood, nicknamed Mike the Bike because he seemed able to win on almost anything with 2 wheels, was one of the greatest racers who ever lived, and in 1966 he climbed onto the RC166 and turned the season into a demolition. He entered 10 races in the 250cc class that year, and he won all 10, every single one. He took the 250cc World Championship in a landslide. He defended it again in 1967, that time in a far tighter fight that came down to who had won the most races. But that first season especially, week after week, the 2-stroke bikes that had been humiliating Honda a couple of years earlier now spent their weekends staring at the back of that screaming 6-cylinder 4-stroke as it vanished up the road, and there was nothing anyone could bolt onto a 2-stroke to answer it. Honda even stretched the same 6-cylinder idea into a slightly bigger 297cc engine for the 350cc class, the RC174, and it won 7 of the 8 races that mattered, carrying Hailwood to that title as well. 2 classes, 2 world championships in the same 1967 season, both built on that 6-cylinder idea. For a company almost nobody in European racing had taken seriously a decade before, it was a statement nobody in the paddock could argue with. Shoichiro Honda had bet the company on the 4-stroke, and for a while he had been losing that bet in public, race after race. The RC166 won it back, and then some, turning one of Honda's most visible embarrassments into the most lopsided run the class had ever seen. So how do you beat a machine like that? You do not. You change the rules so it cannot exist. After the 1967 season, the ground was already shifting under Honda. The sport's governing body, the FIM, had made it clear it was going to outlaw the exotic multi-cylinder machines that had turned Grand Prix racing into an engineering arms race, and Honda's racing program had grown staggeringly expensive. So Honda walked away from Grand Prix motorcycle racing altogether and aimed that engineering brainpower at a new target, Formula One, scaling the same high revving ideas up for 4 wheels. It was the same obsession with revs, just pointed at 4 wheels now, and it would keep Honda chasing that scream for decades. Then, for the 1970 season, the FIM made the ban official, capping the 250cc class at a maximum of 2 cylinders and 6 gears. With one stroke of a pen, engines like the RC166 were made illegal. The Little Six had won the 250cc world title in both of its seasons, and it dominated 1966 without losing a single race. The two-strokes never took the crown back while it was racing. It was retired at the top, and then the rulebook made sure nothing like it could ever line up on a Grand Prix grid again. But the idea inside it was too good to bury. 11 years later, in 1978, Honda rolled out a road bike called the CBX1000, powered by a wide, glorious 1,047 cubic centimeter six-cylinder engine that any rider could walk into a dealership and buy. The man who led that project was the same engineer who had dreamed up the RC166 all those years before, still chasing the same idea, still convinced that more cylinders were the answer. The Screaming Racer had grown into a road-going legend you could park in your own garage, a six-cylinder Honda for the street with the RC166 somewhere in its bloodline. It landed as a flagship built to turn heads, a rolling tribute to the racer that started it all. Today, the RC166 mostly lives behind glass in Honda's museum, wheeled out on rare occasions so a lucky crowd can hear that impossible engine sing one more time. And every time it does, it is still making the exact argument it made in 1966, that the harder path, the one everybody else had written off as a dead end, was the right one all along. Honda didn't just build a better motorcycle than everyone else. For a few screaming seasons, it built the future and then stood back and watched the rest of the world spend 30 years catching up. If you want to see how the rest of that story unfolds, the video on your screen picks up exactly where this one leaves off.